So I just got in from seeing Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And first up, I just want to say right off the bat, the beginning portion of this video will be no spoilers, going over my first impressions, and then I'll timestamp it. I do want to make that clear. It will be timestamped. We'll be getting into a little bit more of a spoiler section of the video. I do want to say, though, this isn't exactly going to be one of those scene-by-scene breakdown videos, but rather a first impression, rambly review after seeing the movie. So apologies if I forget to mention something here, as it's somewhat right off the cuff after seeing it. I got a couple of bullet points here on things that I want to touch on, but yeah, I just wanted to get something out because I literally just got back from seeing the movie, and yeah, I may or may not have had a good and a very emotional time. So as we all know, James Gunn is now the co-head of DC Studios. But before he's fully departed from Marvel, even though he technically has, he still has one more movie to say goodbye with, and that's Guardians of the Frickin' Galaxy Volume 3. And I have to say, right off the bat, this is obviously the no spoiler section, so right off the bat here, that was a fantastic way to close the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy by James Gunn giving a little goodbye wave as he's on his way out the door. And obviously, after bonding with these characters over the past two movies, you know, we've come to love them. It's no surprise that when Guardians was coming out the first time, people were like, you know, Guardians of the Galaxy in the early days of the MCU, but people were really won over by it. Guardians 2, it's a little bit more mixed, by the way. I don't know if it's an unpopular opinion. I think it is, but I actually really like Guardians 2. I don't know about you. Let me know down in the comments below. But obviously, we've seen the journey that they've gone on so far. And without spoilers, Guardians 3 is all predicated off of a core and united family mission that heavily focuses on Rocket, as many of you know, weaving in his origin in a very fundamental way. And as James Gunn says, the core of the story was Rocket and his story. But with that being said, this movie, Guardians 3, being very Rocket-focused, doesn't neglect any of the other Guardians. In fact, through this journey with pretty damn high stakes, it really allows for each character to be utilized in all the ways you'd want them to be individually and as a team, of course, and there's some great team moments in this film. If we look back to the past couple of movies, with the first one, as James Gunn also said, it's the story of the mother, the second movie, the story of the father, and the third is the story of the self. So it's innately more of an intimate movie because of that. And through the intimacy, if you will, of the main plot of Guardians 3, you've probably already heard this, but it's an emotional one. And literally, I was just thinking about it right there and then. And you know, you like a sneeze almost coming on, and you can kind of get that with tears almost coming on. When I think of certain things, like that happened right there and then. You probably didn't see it visibly, but that's how much this movie impacts you if you really are a Guardians fan. And even saying that, I feel, is an understatement. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I've been in tears that much in a movie theater in a long time. Now, you know, not everyone reacts the same way, of course. I'm quite an emotional viewer. I don't always cry. Sometimes I just get the sneeze-like approach to crying, and I don't always get there. But with this one, seriously, like 2 tears rolling down my face at the same time, at least 2 or 3 times in the movie, and then more or less throughout, if that wasn't happening, it was way more than the approaching sneeze of tears. Like, my eyes were glazed up. So yeah, it really got me. It really got me, so truly be prepared for that. But the thing is with this, I'm also not remotely surprised, given the fact that not only it's the last Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and it's quite a definitive feeling close to the chapters that we've seen so far, and given the very deep story it gets into, and most importantly, as I always say here when I cover James Gunn stuff like Peacemaker, yes, believe it or not, if you haven't seen Peacemaker, very emotional, the magic of James Gunn, with his brilliant brilliant ability to mix comedy with a heart-wrenching narrative. He never really misses there. And also, what I'm so thankful for with regards to James Gunn and his Guardians of the Galaxy movies in the MCU is that he doesn't allow his humor and use of comedic scenes to stunt the emotion the movie provides, which I can't say the same for quite a lot of other MCU movies. Now, that's not me saying, disclaimer, that every single other MCU movie out there is without emotional because they always make jokes. No, like there's been many times I've been emotional in MCU movies. But you get my point. James Gunn never really sacrifices emotional beats for, a quick, quip or MCU gag. So don't expect any of that kind of stuff in this movie. It's very, very heartfelt, and none of it is really ruined by a joke. And again, James Gunn always balances stuff like that pretty chef's kiss. And so with that being said, the James Gunn cocktail, if you will, combined with, as he describes, the story of the self and it being the closing film, like, man, what a ride this movie provides. Like, no rhyme intended there. But seriously, what a ride this movie provides. It was just amplified way more than what I anticipated. I knew it would be emotional, but even then I still wasn't quite prepared. It wraps everything up very nicely as a closing story for the Guardians films as a whole, in where you're not only so deeply affected by the journey, but as I mentioned, the balance between comedy and emotion. You're laughing your way throughout it. You're not only doing that, you're entertained, and by the time the credits roll by, ultimately, I would say satisfied for where the characters are left off. Well, I do want to say, in terms of what I've read online, mostly I would say what I'm reading is very, very positive, but at least for me, I was satisfied for where the characters were left off, their journeys thus far, the way it closes. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the spoiler section, as I've read, as I said, some of those opinions on at least a couple of characters and where some fans feel like it could have gone a different direction. But, again, we'll save that for a little bit later. Now, one thing I want to highlight here in one of my bullet points is that the performance of Chukwudi Iwuji is just... like, as High Evolutionary, Chukwudi, I hope I'm not butchering that name, by the way, but it's absolutely phenomenal. Now, I'm really, 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 really trying to not have recency bias here, because again, I went out, saw it today, but when I saw High Evolutionary, I didn't know necessarily what to expect. I knew some things, but he is a villain of whom is very, very intricate to this movie, Rocket's backstory, of course, and I've seen Chukwudi in Peacemaker, and I'm familiar with his acting ability because his performance in that was very, very, very good. Again, Peacemaker, totally unrelated in some ways, but it's another James Gunn project, and that surprised in, as what you would expect, very emotional and very comedic scenes. And Chukwudi was fantastic. So with this, I was familiar with Chukwudi, but I didn't know what to expect still with High Evolutionary. And wow, he makes you absolutely love to hate him. And I mean it, love to hate him. I really enjoyed the way he's involved in the story in terms of how it paces the context of the present, but also how he's deeply rooted in the past. It just kind of fleshed out the story, in my opinion, pretty nicely throughout the movie's events. And there's just so many scenes where Chukwudi steals the show in the character's display of ego, where he's shouting. He's just really commanding. And of course, actors are actors, and I always say this, but after having seen the movie, it is pretty hard for me to imagine someone else as compelling as a performance for High Evolutionary as he did. He definitely deserves his round of applause for this, and then some. Now, as for Will Poulter's Adam Warlock. Now, without spoilers, I've seen a lot of people have some issues with the way that he was adapted in the MCU iteration, even comparing it to something likened to that of the MCU's Mandarin, to give you an idea of what people expected versus that of the reality of the MCU adaptation. So my opinion is I had fun with him in the role, and I definitely appreciated Will Poulter's performance. I found him funny. However, I can perfectly understand the frustration of some comic book fans who wanted a different adaptation of the character. For example, there's Vigilante in Peacemaker. He's quite a bit different from the Vigilante in the comics. Or, there's Drax the Destroyer. And obviously, we've got used to Dave Bautista's portrayal of that character, and a lot of us love it, but still quite different. So it's in that kind of vein where I think people expected something a little bit different, and then they got what we got in Guardians 3. Enjoyable, but may ruffle a few feathers, potentially. So I think overall here, Guardians 3, compared to other MCU entries that mostly expand the MCU lineup, you could say, with regards to the, repercussions it has on the universe-wide storyline, contributing to the larger world building of that particular phase, or perhaps what they're building up to. Guardians has always been pretty damn character-driven. It's a movie within the MCU, of course, but it doesn't try to cater to bolstering up the main narrative of the universe while doing that. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, by the way. I do want to make that clear, such as Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. That was building up more with regards to the future of the MCU, Kang the Conqueror and whatnot. But with Guardians of the Galaxy, because it doesn't have to cater to that, it's totally character first. And I feel that allows James Gunn, on top of all of the other praises I've given, to provide a much more moving and poignant story that audiences can connect to a little bit more than other MCU movies that try and do that, as well as, expand the phases storyline with the larger world building stuff. And again, why? Because it's freaking character first. Sure, there are nitpicks that popped up in my mind, by the way, with regards to this movie here and there. But with that being said, that isn't, all I take into account. For me, when I see a movie, I want to be moved. I want to be invested in the plot, even if there's certain things that I might notice here and there. And one sure way of doing that, and which James Gunn always strives for in all of his projects, and in my opinion succeeds pretty much 9 out of 10 times, at least in this category, is through allowing the audience to connect to these characters through highlighting them in meaningful and touching ways. And in my opinion, that method of impacting the audience will always give an upper hand in the storytelling of a movie. There's probably more I could have mentioned here in the spoiler-free section, but I think that gives you all a good impression if you haven't seen the movie yet and you don't want to go into what I'm about to get into with some of the main things or main spoilers from the movie. So, long story short, what are you doing? Go see this movie if you haven't already. And my enthusiasm there should give you a good bolster for just genuinely how awesome I think this movie is. It's a great time. I don't want to repeat myself from everything I just said, but long story short, go see this film. I would be hard pressed to believe if you weren't emotionally invested and came out having a good time. And perhaps, maybe, just maybe, bring a few tissues with you, because I'm willing to bet if you're even remotely invested in the Guardians films, you just might need them. Okay, spoiler warning. Spoiler warning, we are entering the spoiler timestamp of this video. We're going to get into some of the main things that I want to talk about. The ending, of course, what I thought about with regards to the characters and where they're left off. Again, this isn't like a scene-by-scene breakdown, so I do apologize if I forget some things. Maybe leave a comment down in the comments below if you want to pick my brain about something else. So, I don't know where to begin. Where do I begin with the spoiler talk for Guardians of the Galaxy? Well, I suppose, since I don't have the shield up anymore with regards to talking about Rocket, the way they weaved in Rocket's backstory in the main plot through flashbacks, I felt like it was a very, very effective way of approaching it. Now, to be honest, it's the only way they could have done it since it happened in the past, but I really do feel like it complemented what was going on in the present day very, very nicely. Obviously, it hits very, very hard given everything we see in Rocket's past in the movie, and it involves quite a bit of animal cruelty. And, anytime you see an animal being mistreated, even if it's a CGI animal, still, it's a tough pill to swallow. And even with all of that, putting some of the more tragic aspects of it aside, there were so many endearing scenes that we saw, which, made you even cry tears of the beauty of what we saw. Trying to not be cringy there, but don't know how else to put it. When we spent time with him back in the cages with Lila, Teefs, and Floor. Now, without repeating myself so much from what I already praised with regards to Rocket's backstory in the spoiler-free section, these scenes just hit so hard and gave just a much desired depth to Rocket's character that a lot of fans have been aware of for years, maybe some more than others, knowing a bit about the comic backstory. It was done a little bit differently, but, regardless, have never really seen it delved into too much in the films until now. I felt like it broke up the movie quite nicely. Every time we went back to a flashback, it didn't feel like any time was being wasted. It wasn't like a boring flashback. It always just gave so much more to the movie. And then when you went back to present day and we saw Peter and everyone else trying to save him, go here, go there, it was a race against time. It made those scenes even more interesting until we got another flashback offering even more context. And again, I know I'm repeating myself with this one, but Chakotay as High Evolutionary, he was just so good in these scenes. And in those flashbacks, it just made his villain in the present day that much more interesting and easier to resent from a viewer perspective. Because sure, you could have had him in this movie, but it would have been harder to build up like why this guy is the way he is and why he's just so horrible, absolutely devoid of humanity, disregarding, any kind of, empathy for what he creates. It's just, the way they got into that within just one movie, I was pretty impressed with. But I do think also a lot of it falls onto Chakotay's performance. I know I keep saying it, but I hope those who are commenting down in the comments below are maybe agreeing with me. There's so many scenes I'm just seeing in my mind's eye right now, where he just shouts with his ego and just gets right up into someone's face so much there. When Rocket learns that he wasn't escaping or allowed into the new world, rather. I found him a really, really damn interesting villain. And now I can reflect upon it. I don't think it's weird for me to say that I do believe he's probably the strongest villain out of all the Guardians movies that we've had so far. But going back to Rocket, Bradley Cooper, absolutely fantastic. And whilst saying that, all of the Guardians were great. We have Chris Pratt as Star-Lord, very, very emotional scenes in this movie. Chris Pratt is Star-Lord, and with the stakes, there were some very, very emotional scenes, especially a certain one where he wouldn't give up on Rocket. And as I raved about in the no spoilers section, the character first approach to the Guardians is always a big box check for me. Some of my favorite moments with regards to the characters and what we got into were for sure some examples being the tough exterior of Nebula was cracked open a bit with her concern for Rocket and how much it moved her when she found out that he was okay again. The dynamic of Mantis and Drax and how that even blows back on Nebula to cause that moment. Speaking of dynamics as well, there was obviously a lot going on in this movie, so the team wasn't always together, and at times as the movie went on, you had various different character pairings, and it felt like it did slow down the pacing a little bit at points, but I still really enjoyed those smaller pairings, and it made the moments when we saw the team all together that much more enjoyable, especially as we get into the final act. And that action scene in where the camera just follows them all kicking ass was just fantastic. I mean, action in Marvel movies, we can have a lot of good times there with all the movies that we've had so far, but that moment felt like an earned moment. I actually didn't expect the action to be that cool. And I kind of feel sorry for Nebula because the amount of times she just, went freaking all over the place, her head bent backwards, her arms all broken. Yeah, man, she had a rough time, but there was so many cool little character highlighted moments in certain fight scenes, and would you say that was one of your favorite moments? Because that was definitely kick-ass for me, but I'm pretty sure kick-ass for everyone. But overall, with regards to the Guardians and their characters, it just felt like all the characters had their moments to shine and grow throughout the film in a way that just organically opened new doors for their future. But hey, here's something to talk about. None of the Guardians of the Galaxy died, and I think a lot of people thought at least one would be dying, myself included. I mean, I thought that maybe Rocket was a given, but then at other times I was like, okay, maybe not. Maybe there's going to be a little switcheroo. And then I thought, okay, maybe Drax, though. Maybe Drax. But no. None of them. Now, obviously, Rocket was close at one point, which gave us that brilliant moment with Peter refusing to give up on him, which highlights the tragic deaths that we actually did get, with that of Teefs and Floor and Lila, which leads to that scene in where Rocket reunites with Lila and the others in this kind of afterlife-esque moment, punching in with those emotions once again. And this is what I mean, even when there's not like necessarily a really sad scene, James Gunn still delivers in these kind of beautiful scenes, as I label them, the tears and the emotion. And it's just like, as you're going through the beats of the movie, it's just like, damn, this is like really, really, really good. And again, going back to the deaths though, I thought maybe Drax, as I mentioned a second ago, but no, we're all good. Everyone is accounted for by the end. And to be honest, I actually quite like that. Given where things leave off in the ending, I do believe that you don't need to kill off characters to provide a hard-hitting story that stays with viewers. And case in point here, because nobody dies, and it was still a very, very hard-hitting story that I think people are going to be talking about and remembering as a closing to a trilogy for quite a long time in terms of like the MCU in general. I actually almost forgot that Star-Lord almost died at the end, and to be honest, if I want to get nitpicky, he probably would have in all reality. Maybe he's got a bit of that kind of god juice left and that's why he didn't die. But honestly, thank God he didn't go out that way, because for a second there, it did have me guessing. And you could be like, really though? Like, wasn't it obvious that, oh, you know, it's gonna be fine? Honestly, with the movie and me enjoying it as much as I did up until that point, I was kind of waiting for just like one moment where they're like, oh, I don't know how I felt about that. And I thought maybe that could have been a moment. But if it would have actually turned out that way, I thought that would have been a big thumbs down. Not just because Star-Lord died. Like, if he died in a way that was like, you know, built up and well done, fair enough. But that would have been very lame if he actually went out that way. But he didn't. I also said I'd go back to Will Poulter's Adam Warlock again. And once again, highlighting what a lot of people are saying, that, you know, either disappointed or just not happy. And I will say, from my personal perspective, from what role he had in the movie, it didn't exactly leave me impressed. Like, I'm not gonna lie, like, I wasn't like, oh, like, what an awesome character, right? But I can't lie either in saying that I still had fun with it. I do feel like past a certain point, though, it would have been cool to give him some more development, because I do feel like that was missing, like he was missing a bit of depth there, you know, within the story. They did set up why he is the way he is with regards to his ties to High Evolutionary being his maker, him being a tool to be used, mixing that with his naive-esque self. As they mentioned, he was brought out a little too early. So they did give him some foundations there that set up who he is and why he is the way he is throughout the movie. But at the end of the day, if they wanted to give him a bit more depth, of which I do feel like he needed to make him a bit more interesting, it would have taken away from other parts of the film, and I wouldn't have really wanted that. But I do get how there's quite a few things to be critical of here, and I see why a lot of fans are kind of very much so umming and ahhing about the adaptation of Adam Warlock. I do think that it is because of course, expectations of the character and his adaptation being kind of pretty basic of an implementation. And I guess, you know, for comic book fans, I'd probably go as far as saying that for them, it was more of a parody of the character that they wanted to see. And again, that's not me knocking on it, but it's more actually acknowledging, even though I had fun with it, I can perfectly see why people were a bit like, what? But I do for sure think, especially by the very ending of the movie, there is a lot more room to grow there for him, and he could somewhat lean into the character from the comics a bit more in future years of the MCU, with him becoming more of a competent version of that comic book character. But that depends, of course, on if and when we'll see him grow into that in the future. Now, the very ending of the movie, I was pretty damn satisfied with it. It kind of felt like not a goodbye, but more of a see you later. I do feel like each character and where they got left off was, once again, satisfying. Nebula's desire, for example, to build a bigger community with all the new people on Nowhere, make it a family she never had, made sense, especially with how removed she is from Thanos now. Drax helping out with that, also ringing back to his backstory of being a father. Then there's Mantis, and where she's gone from Guardians 2 to the Christmas special to now. She wants to live a bit more after having always been a follower. Of course, we have Gamora. Obviously not the same Gamora we had. She has a different journey that just simply isn't really tied to the Guardians, and it does make perfect sense in my opinion. Rocket, of course, still doing his thing in the new lineup of the Guardians of the Galaxy team, but of course Peter Quill, Star-Lord himself, with the growth, the seed was planted early on from Mantis of reconnecting with his old family, and he does, which, has been like not just the seed planted in this movie, but arguably way back in time in the trilogy. And at the ending, of course, it takes a minute to finally go back to Earth and reunite with what's left of his family, his grandfather, after having avoided it for so long. Now, one thing I'm seeing people talk about quite a bit that maybe they would have liked to have seen gone differently is Gamora and Peter, in terms of how they would have liked it to have been a much more happy ending for them. But for me, I kind of view it as it was. But just maybe what a lot of fans are saying here is that they desire for them to be together. But I personally understand why that wasn't the case and why James Gunn went this way. Or while I do get that desire for Gamora and Peter to be together again, I was still very satisfied with how things ended up between them. Because at the end of the day, Peter lost that version of Gamora he was in love with. And if anything, it would have felt way more gimmicky and arguably artificially manufactured in the story and the script if this past Gamora developed those same feelings again, even if she kind of fell in love in a new way. I'm still not really for that, because I think the struggle that Peter had with losing Gamora in the first place, wanting that again, if he could have had it his way, even during the early events of this movie, and have her fall in love with him again, he probably would have been happy with that. But the thing is, he learned that along the way, that wanting that again with this new yet past Gamora, chasing something that he had lost, to only realize that it isn't necessarily a guaranteed attainable thing, is one of the full circle narratives that I appreciated. But I don't know. Let me know what you think of that. Would you have wanted them to get together? I just feel like it would have, even though it is technically possible, would have felt almost too fan servicey to an artificial level. And even though this Gamora technically is the same version of Gamora, just in the past, so has absolutely no ties and therefore is still theoretically possible to fall in love with Peter again, there's still a very big distinguishable difference and a very separate version of events that both characters went through. And I rate the way James Gunn went with it. It's almost sad, but it's still a nice ending and resolution to Peter's acceptance of losing the Gamora that he loved. Now, meanwhile, in the post-credits, I almost forgot to mention this, we get a teaser of that Star-Lord will return. Sure, you could say, but what about the other cast? Now, some other cast members are definitely done, but it seems that Chris Pratt is completely game for returning again in this role. So how could we see him? I mean, of course, with the new Guardians lineup, as teased in the other post-credit scene, despite Rocket being the new captain, they could always call on Star-Lord for some more help and another team up. There's obviously more MCU movies and MCU phases to come, so there's possible appearances in future massive MCU team-ups. It's just total and utter speculation at this point, but Star-Lord is still on the table and he is returning again one day, and I would love to know your ideas down in the comments as to how you think he will appear again. But for now, guys, I think that sums up my spoiler thoughts in this review, very rambly review. Most importantly as well after this is, what did you, I suppose, think of my thoughts? Do you agree? Do you disagree with any points? Would you have maybe wanted certain things to go another way? What was your favorite parts of the movie? Of course, what were your just overall thoughts on the movie? movie? Did you really enjoy it like I did? Did you maybe not enjoy it as much? Or did you actually maybe really not like it? Which I still feel like I'm going to be hard-pressed to believe if someone absolutely hates this movie, because I feel like there's just something for everyone in this, even if you're not really much of a Guardians of the Galaxy fan. But I'm looking forward to reading your comments, guys. I read every single one of them. Let me know your reactions. If you got this far in the video, leave me a like. I would really appreciate that. Maybe boost me a little bit more out there in the algorithm of the MCU. Subscribe for more videos like this, of course. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you, fellow Guardians of the Galaxy, in the next video. Goodbye.